Thanks everyone for joining. Let's see. Welcome to session 2 of our series called Championing Gen AI, Bring Your AI Systems to Life Faster. I'm Noah Flaherty, and today we'll be diving into building trust in your AI systems. This is obviously a very critical topic for anyone developing or deploying AI-powered solutions because, as much time as you might spend building out your AI system, if you can't trust it, then it's really hard to kind of put your company's reputation on the line and have your customers interact with your AI systems. So today, I'm super excited to have Sebi Lozano from Redfin, who will walk us through how to build reliable AI systems using a test-driven development approach, as well as using performance monitoring and iterative improvements to create these AI systems you can trust. Sebi and I have been working together for a while now, and it's been an absolute pleasure. One thing that's I've always admired about their approach is taking this test-driven development approach to building AI, which is something you hear a lot about in software engineering, but I'm seeing more and more being applied to the world of AI. Usually that means starting with your tests and then trying to get them to pass. So before I introduce Sebi further, let's just do some quick housekeeping. A few things to keep in mind. One, we'd love to keep things interactive. So please go ahead and if you haven't already, go and introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to learn about what AI projects or products you're working on or any challenges you're facing. We're happy to speak in more depth about specific problems or questions you might have. Speaking of questions, if you have them, please share them. That's awesome. Drop them in the chat or in the Q&A box here in the webinar software that we're using, and we'll tackle them kind of sprinkled throughout the conversation, and we'll save a good chunk of time towards the end as well to hit on any questions we haven't hit on by that point. But nothing's off limits. Ask away. We'll cover all that we can. Number 3, this session is being recorded, so no worries if you have to step away or if you miss anything. After this webinar is over, we'll send an email to everyone that's registered. We'll include the recording, and you can kind of revisit whenever you want afterwards. And then lastly, we'll also include the slides that we have. And towards the end of the slides, we have some resources if you want to go deeper into the topics that we're going to be covering today. Cool. So with that, let's dive in. Real quick on Vellum, we are an AI product development platform, and we help companies turn their AI ideas into production-grade features. And we provide companies like Redfin and others, tools to experiment, test, launch, and monitor their AI systems. So if you have questions about Vellum specifically, feel free to ask those too. We can always answer them offline, if not as part of this webinar. But most of this time is going to be spent on talking about Redfin and what they're doing with AI. So without further ado, I would love, Sebi, for you to kind of introduce yourself, Redfin, and then I'll go to the next slide where we'll talk about, or have you talk about what Redfin used AI for?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Noah. Y'all can hear me okay? Cool.
We can.
I'm Sebi. I'm a senior product manager at Redfin. I've been here for about 4 years. First couple of years worked on our on-demand touring stuff, then started to pivot over to how we could use generative AI at the company. And it's been a really fun journey. I'll tell you a little bit about Redfin itself. We're a technology-powered real estate company. We help people find a place to live with a variety of services. We're a brokerage, so we help you actually buy and sell the home with our agents. We've got rentals, we've got lending, title insurance, and a whole host of other things. We run the country's #1 real estate brokerage site. And since launching in 2006, we've saved customers almost $1.5 billion in commissions, which is particularly relevant given the whole NAR stuff going on right now. And the last thing is just a fun fact. We invented map-based search. So, yeah.
Super cool, Sebi. Thanks so much. Do you want to share a little bit about Ask Redfin and, kind of set the stage for what it is that you all built?
Yeah. In March of last year, we launched Ask Redfin. It's Redfin's first AI-powered virtual assistant. It provides home buyers with quick answers to questions about properties for sale. Most people use it to ask very specific questions about the property because listing pages can get quite long and have a lot of unstructured data. But we've also found some people interested in just the conversational interface and asking questions about general questions about home buying or what's it like to work with Redfin. So it's been an interesting interesting journey.
Super cool. Thanks. Well, I guess let's start with some of the basics. Why build Ask Redfin in the first place? What was the problem that you wanted to set out to solve? And what did it require for you as a company to feel comfortable putting AI in the driver's seat of asking your customers questions?
Yeah, we had an older feature on our listing pages called Ask a Question. The idea was users would be looking for very specific information on the page. They wouldn't be able to find it either because it wasn't there or because it was hard to find. And they would type in a question into a text box and it would go off into the ether. And eventually you'd get calls and texts from a few agents trying to answer that question on your behalf. Honestly, though, sometimes just trying to get you on a tour and convert you. And we thought that experience could be way better. You'd also have to wait a few minutes or hours or days for that answer. Generative AI, when it came up, just felt like a really natural way of solving that problem. We could provide instant answers to you by providing the listing context to the LLM. And we could also make that conversational experience way more delightful rather than you sending a text or sending a question in a text box and waiting to hear back in a few hours or days via email or call. You could just get the answer back in the
it makes a ton of sense. So it sounds like maximizing time to answer was a big value prop to your consumers. Hey, use AI to answer questions factually based on information about the property, and do so quicker than a human might have been able to.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. People talk a lot about hallucination in the world of AI and how, GPT-4 might make something up. What tool or how did you provide, what kind of context did you provide the AI or these prompts in order to combat that?
The main context we provide is all the data that we have about a listing. We had a RAG step right before providing it to the LM, or retrieval augmented generation. I think that's what it stands for. Maybe I forget. Where we had some heuristics for comparing what the question is and what data we have access to, and we then gave it a very specific chunk of data to answer it on. We also spent a lot of time kind of giving the prompt or tuning the prompt and giving the LLM very specific instructions on how to answer questions, when to say I don't know, things like that.
You said something really interesting at the end there. You said when to say I don't know, and that's not always an obvious step for folks, right? One thing that I think we've done and worked on together is getting the AI to admit when it doesn't know rather than hallucinate. And for the folks listening here, that's a really powerful tool. If you can do perform the prompting necessary to get the AI to be able to confidently answer a question, if it was provided the context needed. But if it doesn't know, just say so, and don't try to make stuff up. So that's one great way of combating hallucination. So Sebi, my understanding is the real estate world is a pretty regulated industry, and there's certain standards that you need to comply with, and as a byproduct that your AI needs to be able to comply with. Can you speak more towards some of that and how did you know whether or not the AI was complying?
Yeah. I'll speak first about just our constraints. Redfin's in real estate, it's a very sensitive space, not just from a value standpoint, this is people deciding where to live, but also from a legal standpoint. There are regulations around how advice can be provided. Fair housing, the Fair Housing Act is the main thing there. You can't provide advice that discriminates based on race, sex, gender, and a whole host of other protected characteristics. And we also have to consider licensing constraints too. To provide real estate advice, you need to pass a test and become licensed as a real estate agent. So we wanted our virtual assistant to uphold our fairness principles, one, and two, not violate any licensing constraints. We didn't want the bot to be providing advice. We wanted the assistant to be really just answering questions, factual questions about that property. The way we got serious about it was using Vellum for evals. We really thought kind of test first. We were pretty worried about just eyeball, given kind of the sensitivity in the space and the responsibility we had to our users. It felt wrong to just kind of eyeball a few samples of answers and kind of just make a gut call on whether it was good or not. We felt like it'd be really important to create, on the order of hundreds or thousands of test cases that were a range of easy to tricky, that tested across a variety of different dimensions. I'll mention two: correctness and fairness. And then use Vellum's eval suite to run through all those test cases, make a change depending on how well it performed, and just continue that cycle until we got into a place that was good enough.
Nice. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's break it down. So I guess taking a step back, the problem to be solved here is building in this case, an AI powered chatbot that you can trust your consumers to interact with, and that it's going to comply with the fair housing agreement. It's not going to hallucinate. You call these constraints. And I think that's a really good vocab here, where typically when you're building an AI powered feature, there's certain constraints that you want it to stay within. And so, the naive approach is to just manually test it, have the AI generate something, spot check it, eyeball it, and be like, yep, looks good, let's ship it. But it sounds like you guys, there's a lower risk tolerance, right? You needed, legally needed to comply, and you're releasing this to the public and consumers. So who knows what people are going to throw at it. And so there's, I guess step one in the world of eval, step one is probably determine your risk tolerance level. Step two is within your risk tolerance level, define what constraints you want your AI to be bounded within. And Sebi, feel free to interrupt me if you disagree with any of these steps or if you have anything to add. After you've defined your constraints, it sounds like number three is encode the logic, figure out how to determine whether or not that constraint is being upheld. So usually that's comparing against some expected answer or checking to see that it said what it was supposed to say. And then fourth is build out some test cases where you're providing example input values to the AI. You're providing the expected outputs and then using an eval suite, whether it be Vellum or otherwise, to perform those comparisons across those different constraints. Is that accurate so far?
Yeah, I think the way I'd add that is I actually wouldn't necessarily frame it as constraints, because I think that makes it very specific to things. I think what people should be thinking about is, what does good mean for your product? Yes. And good is, a function of some constraints like fairness, but also is just, it's sometimes just is it correct? Is it in the right tone? And so I do think you have to start with defining really crisply what good means for an answer in your product, or, if it's a chat product, it's an answer. If it's something else, it's something else. And think about how you'll judge those responses, and then it jumps into the whole eval process.
Yeah, we call these you can think of it as goodness dimensions, right? It's when you look at an AI generated response, you're in your head as a human thinking, oh yeah, that's good, or oh no, that's bad. But I'd encourage folks out there to go a level deeper. What does good actually mean? Chances are you're evaluating good across multiple different dimensions. Sebi, I think you mentioned at least three, right? Correctness, is it factually correct? Tone, is it acting professional or formal enough or whatever? And then third for you, a true constraint, which is does it comply with the Fair Housing Act?
Yeah. And I'll add there too that these questions aren't super easy. Even if you take correctness, even correctness might vary depending on your use case. For one use case, correct might mean an exact match. For another use case, it might mean something like getting the gist of the answer, or being just factually correct. So you do have to be really thoughtful about and very crisp about what good means. Yep. You don't have to have it all figured out before you start developing. Personally, I like to think about what good means before seeing an answer in the first place, but that's going to change because I'm going to type something into the assistant. It's going to say something and say, oh, why does that not feel so good? And maybe that'll mean making one dimension crisper, or it might mean adding a new dimension of what good means.
That's cool. For context, like Vellum's eval framework lets you define these like what we call metrics, which is a way of encoding your definition of good and having different metrics, one per dimension that you want to score against. And typically what we see is people are defining their metrics with either like code, and it's a deterministic process. So Sebi mentioned exact match, and that's a good example, right? Like, does the output text exactly match this expected output text? But anything that code, like you can run code and run these like as metrics or evaluators to perform these comparisons. A second big category that we see is like using AI to grade or judge another AI. And that, we'll talk about that in a little bit. People call that LLM as a judge. And, but the common denominator in all of this is that you have like one metric per goodness dimension, right? That you want to score across. And a good evals framework will be one that's flexible enough to let you define these different metrics. It might provide metrics just ready to go out of the box for you. And it provides a way of like running these metrics against a lot of test cases. We have some great questions coming in. One from Adriana Sebi. How much testing and tuning do you do before releasing a feature? Or do you release it first and fix issues based on real use cases later? And I suspect this has to do with like, again, risk tolerance levels, right? Any commentary on that?
Yeah, I think it comes down to risk tolerance. And I think it also, it varies based on where you are in the feature lifecycle. For us, when we were first launching Ask Redfin, we don't even know what good enough was. We had to set a baseline. And so we spent months iterating on the system, the prompts, were the test cases right? Did they capture everything we wanted to capture? Did we feel good about the product we were putting out in the world? After we launched the first version of the product, whenever we're making tweaks or changes, we already have a pretty good sense, because of evals, we have a good sense of what the baseline is. So it's way easier. You make a change, you run the eval, you get a result. It's either better or worse. And it just makes the post-launch feature iteration cycle way faster.
Yeah, that's crucial, right? Like evals is so much more than just like deciding whether or not your feature is ready to ship. It's giving you that like peace of mind that once you've shipped it, you can make changes without fear of regressing functionality. So regression testing. In the world of software engineering, we write automated tests rarely because the value is like in testing it as part of delivering the feature, but a lot of the value is ensuring that that feature doesn't break in the future when other people make changes to code. And, I think people think about AI as this like crazy new different thing, but there's so many parallels between good AI development and good software engineering and software development. And if you do something in software development like testing, like chances are it has value in the world of AI development too. Let's see. So Sebi, can you talk more about kind of that iteration cycle? So make a change, run evals, make a change, run evals. Like, what does that loop look like? And what does it mean to like make a change? What are the types of changes that you would typically be making?
Yeah, I'll talk about the cycle first. I think it's, I think there'll be a question. We'll hopefully talk about test case generation too, which I think is a really big step a little bit later. So I'll skip over that for now. But assume you have a set of test cases. You will take your system, you will run your system on those hundreds or thousands of test cases, and you'll get a 1 or 0 on each of those test cases. And the first thing we'll do is we'll look at the test cases that failed and ask ourselves how bad these failures are. We had some judgment-based categorization of is it a ship blocker? Is it a should fix? Is it a nice to fix? And we would just start with the ship blockers, and we would look at the generated answer and the expected answer and try to understand the difference. We step through the Vellum workflow that we had designed to see where the issue had happened, because our system is not just a single node system. There's many nodes in the system. And then at that point, it would be kind of clear what went wrong or why it might have gone wrong. And I'd note down 1 or 2 things that I might do to fix the system for this specific test case. I'd go through every single one of the test cases, collate these big set of notes. I'd make all the changes in one go, and then rerun the eval and see where we were now.
Cool. So for those not as familiar with Vellum, Sebi was saying workflows and nodes, and to put that in more like generic terms, it's a multi-prompt system, right? It's not just like one prompt that is handling all user interactions. I think you had one prompt that like classifies what type of question it is, and that routes it to another prompt that's like really good at answering that question. And that's like the general architecture. We won't go into details here. And so being able to test this kind of like end-to-end system is also very valuable, where you might unit test individual prompts where you mock the input and a certain output, but also being able to like end-to-end test the entire chain of interactions, it sounds like was pretty useful.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Okay, so pattern goes like define what good means, create metrics to like deterministically measure good across that one dimension, create test cases, which we'll talk about in a second, that help you measure goodness given some set of inputs, run your evals against your prompt or your chain of prompts, get some scores, see where the evals didn't do so well, go back, make tweaks, rerun those test cases, rinse and repeat until what?
Until ultimately it's, for each dimension, it's two things. Let me take a step back real quick on like what our trust building system at Redfin was. There was one part of this, which was what we've been talking about, structured evaluation, where we have very specific test cases, dimensions. You can grade each of these test cases and get to a score. The other way that we build confidence was we also ran kind of more unstructured evaluation sessions. We called them break it sessions. We took, a few dozen Redfinians, put them in a room, told them to play with this virtual assistant, and just asked them to try to break it in the dimension that they were like an expert on. So our legal team would try to break it from a fairness perspective. Our real estate agents would try to break it from a correctness perspective, and so on. And we gave them a way to indicate to us when things were not going as well as possible. And we essentially take the outputs of both of these processes, review any instances where things were failures, and again, go back to the ship locker categorization. Ultimately, we would keep iterating until we had no ship lockers left that we could detect. We tried to get through a lot of the should fixes. And then the nice to haves, as is the nature and product, come a little bit later. So ultimately it's a judgment call. But we put a little bit of structure around it to make sure that we,
there's two like really interesting points to me in that. You said ultimately it's a judgment call. And I think that's like so true, right? Like, people get excited about evals because it finally brings like a quantitative measure of good versus bad to like a pretty non-deterministic problem. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like you're still going to get a bunch of scores and have to decide, like you as a human determining whether or not to ship this product, are those scores good enough? So there's still a little bit of art in what is otherwise now finally like a lot more science than your like typical vibe checks or spot checks.
Exactly.
Another interesting thing you talked about was like the role that human evals had to play in this, where you said that you had a bunch of Redfinians go in a room and try to break it and like rate whether or not they were able to break it. There's a lot of talk about like human evals versus automated evals. Can you speak more about like what role each of those played and like at what points in the like AI development lifecycle they played that role?
Yeah. In general, we can talk about kind of the, I think any good strategy for some big product is going to involve a little bit of both. And here's why. The structured evals are going to let you and your team iterate quickly and independently from other people's thoughts. And you'll be able to get the product to a pretty decent state, assuming your test cases are pretty good. We'll talk about that in a second. I think that the human evals are what were kind of the final check for making sure that we were good to ship the product. And we ended up having 2 or 3 of those. And they all served a few different roles, which I'll talk about. The first one was you gave these Redfinians a sandbox that we built to interact with the virtual assistant, and a way to essentially create test cases. That's how they would report things. They would report things by saying, this is an interesting situation where I'm going to create a test case. Either it handled it correctly, or at that early stage in the process, it handled it incorrectly. And so there's kind of a first human involvement step, which we use to kind of bootstrap test case generation, rather than us sitting down, or me alone sitting down and writing hundreds of test cases. We used the collective Redfin mind to create them. And so the first session was less about like evaluating and more about bootstrapping those test cases. Then you had human eval step number 2, maybe a few weeks or a month into the development process, where you got kind of what we framed as like a beta of the virtual assistant. And then we had one final one that was kind of like, okay, we feel very good about this product. Let's just make sure we get one final confidence check from a big group of people.
Nice. If I draw analogies to the world of software engineering, people talk about like the test pyramid, right? And you've got like your unit tests, your integration tests, your end-to-end tests. But it sounds like the test period in the world of AI has like manual, like human testing at the very tippy top of that test pyramid. That's cool. So we've got a couple of questions here. One from Murari, which maybe we've kind of implicitly answered. What are the key factors that help build trust in AI systems, especially when they're designed for human interactions and collaboration? If I was to recap what we've said so far in the context of this question, it's like, define what good looks like and decompose good into multiple different dimensions. Make sure that like any stakeholders in your company have a chance to weigh in and like agree that those are good definitions of good. In your case, Sebi, I think you said that was legal and FHA, right? Like the legal team needed to be involved to say like, yes, we're happy as long as it does well in this dimension.
Yep.
Anything else that you'd add to this question?
I think just be very transparent on where it's not living up to expectations. Like let people peek into, don't just say, hey, there are no ship blockers and there are X issues that are shit fixes. Like talk people through how you made that categorization and why, and let people disagree. It's a good way of building trust. It's also a good way of highlighting instances where maybe you were too aggressive in evaluating the assistant, or maybe you were too lax in evaluating the assistant.
Yeah, that's a good one. There, like this concept of like transparency in the world of AI, like has so many different meanings, right? Like on one hand, you want to be transparent with your stakeholders, like you're saying, like where it's doing well, where it's not. I think the tech itself has an opportunity to be transparent too, right? Like you want to be tracking what you're sending the AI and what it's sending back. Like, especially if you're using a multi-prompt system, like you want to see at each step of the way and log this stuff and measure and like basically have an audit trail of what it's doing. And that's another way of driving transparency. My take is like the less of a black box you can make AI, the more trust there's going to be in what it's doing.
I agree.
Let's see. So let's talk a little bit about how one goes about building up their test cases. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit more about the different types of metrics and like LLM evals maybe. But yeah, let's talk about test cases. So it sounds great in theory, right? It's like, cool, I've got some metrics. What exactly is a test case and how do you create them?
Yeah, a test case is a sample input to the system, and then either an expected answer if you want to compare an expected answer to a generated answer, or it might just be a sample input. There are some things that you can evaluate, like tone, without an expected answer on a per test case basis. You can just use an LLM as a judge, for example, to evaluate whether the generated answer subscribes to certain criteria that you defined.
Cool. So that's really cool. That's basically like if you think about a prompt or a series of prompts, there's some like runtime inputs that you're passing it. And usually prompts take the form of like a template, right? Where there are a bunch of static content, maybe some variable content, and it's this variable content that that a customer would typically like invoke at runtime that you're including as your test case inputs.
Exactly.
And then it sounds like you're saying that depending on the metric, you might include what we call like ground truth data to compare against. And that ground truth data is usually in the form of a expected answer or correct answer or something like that.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? It's more general than actually just a sample, but it's runtime data. So for Ask Redfin, it was not just the question someone's answering; it was also maybe the listing they were asking a question about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so an example could be like, of a test case could be like, does this home have a basement? And I give it the question, I give it the listing, and then I give it an expected answer that's based on that listing. It's either yes or no.
Cool.
And then evals goes through and says, okay, we generate an answer. Doesn't match the expected answer?
Yep. So in our experience of working with companies, there's usually like two friction points in setting up evals. One is like defining the metrics. And so, we put a lot of work into trying to like provide you ready to go metrics. The second one is test case generation, where somebody needs to come up with these tens, hundreds, thousands of input output pairs that you want to run your evals against. What are some of the different ways that you guys came up with these test cases, and like how do you see that evolving down the road?
Yeah, we had one main way where we did this. And this goes back to kind of the bootstrapping thing I was talking about earlier. We got 20 to 30 like very cross-functional Redfinians in a first break-it session. We gave them a very early raw version of the virtual assistant. We gave them some guidelines around what we expected people to ask, what your focus should be. And then we built an internal sandbox that let people chat with the assistant and easily create a test case that we could then use in automated evals. And that was probably the single most important way that we went from literally having maybe a few handful of things that me and the team had come up with to thousands of test cases that we could then run on an automated basis. For more sensitive stuff like fair housing, those are instances where I would sit down with very specific team members and not just trust the big Redfinian brain. We'd kind of go through the test cases that were generated through that session or things that team really wanted to make sure were evaluated properly. And we'd go through each of them and make sure that we had enough of those test cases that, for fairness, for example, that we covered every protected characteristic in those questions. So it depended on the dimension, but the main strategy was use the Redfinian brain to bootstrap these test cases.
So like maybe some like handful of questions that you and your direct team, just like thought of and used as test cases, but then basically have like a beta or staging environment and have internal employees run things and flag things. That's cool. What about once it was live? Like, did you find like problematic cases once this thing was live and use those as test cases?
Maybe I should knock on wood or something, but we've been generally pretty pleased with how it's performed after launch. There might be a few instances where it hasn't answered things quite perfectly, and we have added that into our test case suite and made sure that it's answered correctly. That's a good way to. That's also a good thing to add. I think the other thing I'll add is we did find some success in using synthetic test case generation too. Once you had those first 1,000 kind of like human generated test cases of what good and bad meant, there were some times where we'd find like kind of like avenues that we weren't sure were super well tested, and asking an LLM to take these like human generated test cases and vary them on some dimensions so that we had a little bit more diversity in a test case suite did help us build confidence in the bot.
That's cool. I mean, it's wild. Like, it's just so cool to hear like how well it's been working, or like how well it's been, doing what it's supposed to do. And I guess that, ladies and gentlemen, is like the value of test-driven development and putting that investment up front. I will say that a lot of people that we work with, it's rarely ever like perfect on the first go, right? And there will always be some number of edge cases that you experience once the thing's finally live. And I guess my like word of advice for those listening in is make sure that you're like instrumenting tooling needed to capture and log your live traffic, such that when you do inevitably come across a problem case from like real user interaction, make it such that you can easily use that as a test case in your test suite. And what's nice about that is you can kind of like passively and easily build up your eval suite to be more and more robust over time. And that can be a really powerful approach. Sebi, you mentioned synthetic test case generation. I think there's been a lot of hype lately in this world recently. Do you see that becoming like more and more of a thing, like more of a source of test cases? Like, and I guess like follow-up question, how many human generated ones do you think you need as seeds to be like a good starting point?
Yeah, I'll answer the first one first. I think synthetic generation plays it depends on what you're using it for. I think it is not a good idea to rely on synthetic generation for just from like zero for your first 100 test cases or your first 1,000 test cases. I think you are probably putting too much reliance on the LLM there, and I think it does behoove the builder to really think deeply about what good means and spend time writing out test cases manually. I do think it plays a really big role, and once you have that set, and I'm not exactly sure what that number is exactly. I think it's going to depend on a company by company basis and how much time you have and how much risk tolerance you have to scale up those test cases into the thousands. I don't have a specific number. I can just tell you it's a function of resources and risk tolerance.
Absolutely. I think as with most things, the answer is it depends. Here's another question coming in. Like, what challenges do you foresee in scaling evaluation processes for AI systems that facilitate large-scale real-time collaboration and learning experiences?
I think one thing that comes to mind, and I'm not sure. Oh yeah. Large-scale real-time collaboration. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I think I'll answer the first half of the question, which is challenges in evals as things scale. Multi-turn conversations are hard to evaluate quantitatively. And here's why. Single turn. So single turn is just you have one input question, does it come out of the basement, and then you have an expected answer. Virtual assistant is expected to say yes or no or something like that. And that's easy because when you make a change to the system, you expect that final assistant answer will be the only thing that changes. What ends up happening with multi-turn eval, so if you're trying to evaluate multiple turns in a conversation, so user assistant, is you save a multi-turn test case between a human and an assistant, then you make a change to the assistant system. And at this point, your multi-turn test case is actually pretty invalid because earlier turns in the conversation might no longer be realistic given the change you made to the system or to the workflow. And that's not something we've quite figured out yet. And I think it's going to be important because as these products get better, you want people to be spending more time conversing with the assistant. So multi-turn eval, making sure that the system is robust to really long conversations is going to be more and more important.
Yeah, there's, multi-turn conversation testing is tricky, right? Like, because ultimately, if you're on the third turn, which means like there's been two back and forths between the user and AI up until that point, and you're trying to assert that the third response from the AI is appropriate, like that fundamentally means that you're assuming the conversation has been like a specific set of messages up until that point. But if you change your prompt to test and you want to test that, like it fundamentally changes your test set such that you would have gotten a different conversation up until that point in the first place. So kind of confusing if hopefully folks are following along, but I think the two approaches you and I have explored there is being okay with that and just like assuming that if the conversation is a certain set of messages up until this point, is the third one correct? The other one that is a bit more like exploratory that we've tried is having an AI simulate the user for the first and second messages in order to generate the third.
Yeah.
Which is a little more like wild and crazy, unproven. But if anyone in the crowd has done any of this or like played around with like multi-turn conversation evals, would love to hear any thoughts there.
And this is also an example, we talked earlier about like when is it better to have human spot checks versus quantitative evals. This is one area where I'd say this is a big risk for your product. You're going to get a better sense of this by putting humans to test it.
Mm-hmm. The TLDR there, really easy to test the first turn of the conversation. The farther out you go, the harder it is to test. Awesome. Question from Puneet here. How often do you update your prompts or your prompt chains? And when you update them, do you let the end user know or just magically make the output better for them?
When we make a change, we don't communicate the changes to users, or we haven't yet at least. That doesn't mean that we'll never do it. We don't think about like how often we should change it as like some sort of like dogmatic rule. If we have a very specific idea on how to make the system better, we'll make it, whether that's to drive more engagement or drive more conversion. I would say that we have on the order of like, 3 to 7 things that we want to test every month or so. So some of them work, some of them don't.
Yeah, I guess this really depends on like your domain, right? And like the level of investment that you want. I can say that personally, like if I see problematic outputs from my AI, I'd probably just treat it like a bug, like any other software bug, and I give it a severity level, right? Like, is it a Sev 1 and like, was it a really bad response? Or was it a Sev 3 and it's like, yeah, it could be better. And then just triage it like you would any other software bug. But ideally, my take is that your tooling and processes should be such that if you had infinite time, or like if you had the desire to, like, your tooling should support rapid iteration, right? It should be really easy to make a change, run your evals, feel confident you didn't regress, ship it. And that like it should be possible for that iteration loop to be really, really fast. And the only bottleneck to that iteration loop should be a matter of like, how important is it to you that the AI responds perfectly, Cool. We've talked LLM as a judge. I guess just for vocab, like people call this different things, right? LLM as a judge, or LLM graders, AI evaluators, AI metrics. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is using one LLM to judge or grade the output of another LLM. There's a lot to talk about here. I guess, like, Sebi, just to get going, like, is this something that you guys used or experimented with? Like, how deep down that path did you personally go?
Yeah, we heavily used LLMs as judges. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's an important way of speeding up AI development. I think if you give LLMs a very specific task, they'll be pretty good at it. The intern analogy people use really resonates. Treat an LLM as like an intern. You can give a very clear task, but very specific. The more specific you can make it, the better. I think more philosophically, it's just a good exercise to make them, even if you don't end up using them, because it forces you to write down what is good and be really crisp
That's
about
really
that.
cool.
And
like I thought
of acceptance criteria, but you can be a little bit more freeform and not as, stressed about whether you're subscribing to Scrum laws or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of like creating a recipe for a baker, right? Like, baking is like such you get like one measurement off and like your baked good might not be the same. And if you can't make a really, really good recipe for your LLM judge, like it means that you probably don't truly know what good looks like. And what's more so, it's harder to get alignment within a bigger organization or across stakeholders on what good means. And therefore it's harder to trust AI once it's live because people have their own internal definition of good. But if you can write down a recipe for an LLM to follow on grading this thing and it does a good job at that, then it probably means you've done a good job of defining what good looks like. And you have a very clear set of criteria that you can share internally to your stakeholders to make sure that there's alignment on it.
Yeah. This was also probably the hardest part about building Ask Redfin. Creating the LLM as judges is hard, not just conceptually, because you really need to be crisp about defining what's good and what it is. But also, this is not an area where you want to rely on like synthetic test case generation or just the Redfinian mind. This is going to be kind of like a primitive part of your system in evaluating everything. Like you as the builder need to sit down and write every single test case down. And you need to really understand where it fails, and you need to have a really high bar on kind of accuracy for this LLM as judge, because errors are going to start to compound if you don't truly understand this level of your system.
Yeah. Like it. Speaking of risk tolerance, right? Like your risk tolerance for your LLM judge evaluator has to be even lower than your risk tolerance for the product itself, is what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Like you need to have very high confidence that this evaluator is working the way it's meant to. Otherwise, you won't be able to trust its grades that it produces.
Yeah. It's also, I guess, it's probably also a function, again, of resourcing too. If you do have access to very frequent human spot checks, then maybe you can relax on this a little bit. But I think it's worth spending time to make your judge as accurate as you can.
Is it turtles all the way down? Like, do you make evaluators for your evaluators at that point?
No, we haven't done a judge to judge. We haven't made a judge to evaluate an evaluator. We'll typically just do like an exact match, because the evaluator is typically outputting like a binary.
But I guess like, are you? It sounds like you could set up evals for your LLM judge, but you might not need an LLM evaluator to judge your LLM evaluator, but you might still want evals with a more deterministic.
Yes, but I guess that's not a turtle all the way down. I think it's a quantitative way of evaluating something. Yeah, I think that exists at every step of the process. But at one point the rubber meets the road, and I think you want some good old human eyes on it.
Yeah. But I guess like one takeaway there is, if you're using LLM as a judge, one way to build confidence that your evaluator works correctly is to set up an evaluator for it, but probably not an LLM evaluator, probably a good old deterministic exact match. Hey, did it produce the score that it was supposed to?
Yep.
Cool. When does it make sense to use LLM as a judge versus more deterministic methods like exact match or semantic similarity? Or
it's a good question. I think it's when you need to. It's
the same for this one.
Yeah, it's going to be way more common in this. What makes generative AI so exciting is the same thing that makes LLM as judges so exciting, which is the answers are non-deterministic, and so you can't rely on these more deterministic ways of evaluating an answer. So I think
One pattern I've seen, for what it's worth, is like, I guess there's two places where I see LLM judges being used. One is when there's just no way to like deterministically write code to like measure the thing. So I think your example of tone is a good one, right, Sebi? Where it's like, hey, does this output, like prompting an LLM to say like, hey, here's an answer being generated by another AI system. we want to make sure that the answer is professional, doesn't use emojis, is like the right level of formal, and conforms to these brand guidelines that our branding team gave me. Please produce a value between like, and then usually you provide like a rubric, like 0 means way far, and you write this in your prompt, right? Like 0.5, 1, whatever it might be, and you give definitions for each of these scores. And so I guess to summarize that point, it's like non-deterministic measurement is one good one. Mm-hmm. And then the second one that I see a lot of is like when you don't have ground truth data to compare against. Like maybe you just like straight up don't have the right answer. Or actually tone is a good example too, where there's no ground truth to compare against. You just need to generate a score based on the tone. Yep. And so in both of those two cases, I often see LLM as a judge being used.
Yep. That's right. That's a thank you for answering
that. Let's see. Another one from Puneet here. Any thoughts on proper role-based hierarchical agentic systems beyond a simple chain? How do you compare the performance with a non-agentic system? That's a tricky one.
That's a tricky one. We have not played with non-chain systems yet. I know that they're becoming more popular, and they might have a role. And as I think one of the big issues in the past has been the cost of inference. That's been tanking too. So as inference gets cheaper, as these models get smarter, I think they're going to become a lot more exciting. But they were pretty prohibitively expensive to build when we were thinking about launching as Redfin.
Yeah, certainly at the scale that you guys are operating at.
Yeah.
One thing I think about with agentic systems is, oftentimes they're performing side effects, right? They're performing actions. Maybe they're calling an API, or they're updating a database record, or they're like doing something themselves instead of a human. And just like, again, going back to software development, if you think about like testing functions that perform side effects, you're usually like mocking out those side effects and asserting that they were invoked. So that would be one thing I think about with agentic systems. Like, given these sets of inputs, I want to assert that the agent performed this action that it should have performed. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's one way I would think about it. Cool. What advice would you give a company that is starting on the RAG and LLM journey and wants to service data insights, but has some significant challenges to source data standardization and centralization?
Oof. That's tough. One of the big benefits here was we had a listing page, and we've spent, teams had spent years getting that data in a good standard way. I'm trying to think if I have any actionable advice, because we didn't have to run into that issue a lot. We definitely spent a good amount of time like taking the data that other teams have structured for us and centralizing it in a way that we can represent it to an LLM. But we didn't have to deal with, they're all very tractable problems. Yeah. I would say maybe my most tangible advice is you got to solve that first.
Yeah. Richard, the follow-on advice I'd add here is reduce scope, right? Like maybe you don't try to boil the ocean to begin with and don't try to standardize like all the data that you want to standardize. But going back to the whole, like, I don't know, having an LLM say, I don't know is really, really powerful, because maybe you start with scoping down the amount of data that you need to standardize such that you expect the AI to say, I don't know, like 50% of the time. And in those cases, you flag it to a human for review. And you really just focus on getting the data needed to solve the other 50% and focus on that. And then like prove value, prove that you're solving a real customer problem, prove that the AI, just build a tracer bullet through that 50% of data. And once you've got that working, then chip away at reducing the number of times the AI has to say, I don't know, due to the need for additional data. So that would be my take there.
Yep.
Awesome. These are really, really great questions coming in from the crowd here. So thank you. Please keep them coming. Looking through my set, can you talk more about like any metrics that you developed that you're specifically like proud of, or that you think are like were critical towards the success of this? And feel free to not go into the details if there's like secret sauce on any of these.
I think it comes down to what we talked about with the dimensions of what good means. Like, those were the metrics we created, and two of the ones I can talk about is correctness. Is the answer correct, accurate, and factual? You can create test suites that help you answer that question, and also fairness. Does the answer comply with Redfin's fairness guidelines? And having a structured way of evaluating those things was really, really helpful. And then in general, this is more standard system things, but tracking response latency, number of conversations started, and conversion, that's less of an eval thing and more of is the product being successful. Yeah. But that was also really important.
Awesome. Well, we're starting to come up on time, so let's just do a quick recap. What we've talked about here, first things first, you have to like define success, right? Like, what does good look like, and try to decompose good into a few different dimensions. Second, consider this test-driven development approach where you start with your metrics, you start with your test cases, and you iterate on your prompts or your prompt chains until you get them to pass. And then, for cases where it's more subjective or you don't have ground truth data to compare against, LLM as a judge is becoming increasingly a valuable tool in the world of evals. And then finally, like, the end benefit of doing all this investment is ultimately it lets you iterate more quickly and gives you a higher degree of trust in your system as you go live, and notably as you make changes once it is live. But, that is pretty much a wrap. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who joined us here today. Again, my name is Noah Flaherty, co-founder and CTO here at Vellum. I'm so grateful and happy to have Sebi Lozano from Redfin here to join us. Sebi, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for the excellent conversation. But please, for those in the crowd here, doesn't have to end now. We're on LinkedIn. Feel free to DM us, ask questions. And if you are interested in how Vellum can help you along your evals journey, reach out to us. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sebi. Take care.
Thanks, you all.